So you've almost certainly heard of PTSD, but what about complex PTSD? They sound really similar, right? But they're not the same thing at all. And understanding the difference, well, it's absolutely key to understanding just how deeply trauma can shape a person. Today, we're going to break down both conditions using official guidelines from the NHS. It's a question I think a lot of us have asked ourselves at some point. Why do certain events, long after they're over, still have this power? Why do they keep showing up in our daily lives as anxiety or fear, or just that feeling of being constantly on edge? This is really the heart of what we're exploring today, the lasting echo of a traumatic experience. All right, before we dive in, just a quick but really important note. All the information in this explainer is based on NHS guidelines. But, of course, for any personal medical advice, you should always consult your GP. Okay, with that said, let's get into it. So here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll talk about trauma's echo. Then we'll get a solid understanding of PTSD. After that, we'll look at what happens when trauma is repeated, which will bring us to complex PTSD. Then we'll do a direct side-by-side comparison, and we'll finish up by talking about the different paths toward healing. Okay, first up, let's lay the groundwork by taking a closer look at the condition most of us are already familiar with, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. So what is it exactly? Well, according to the NHS, PTSD is a mental health condition that can pop up after someone goes through a really stressful, frightening, or distressing event. Now, the key thing to grab onto here is the trigger. It's a reaction to a specific, and often a singular, traumatic experience. And it's way more common than you might think. The NHS estimates that about 1 in 3 people who go through a severe trauma will actually develop PTSD. So that begs the question, right? Why do some people develop it and others don't? We don't have all the answers, but it just goes to show how personal our response to trauma really is. The kinds of events that can lead to PTSD can be really varied, but they all share this common thread of being overwhelming and often life-threatening. You can see here on the slide, we're talking about things like serious accidents, assaults, or being in combat. Notice that these are typically discrete, definable experiences, a moment or a set of moments that are clearly marked in time. Now, when we talk about the symptoms of PTSD, they generally fall into 3 main buckets. First, you have re-experiencing, which is basically the event invading the present moment. The second is avoidance, which is all about trying to escape anything that reminds you of the trauma. And third is hyperarousal, that constant, exhausting feeling of being on edge. So what does that actually look like in real life? Well, re-experiencing could be vivid flashbacks or recurring nightmares. Avoidance isn't just a thought. It's actively staying away from people or places that might trigger those memories. And that hyperarousal, that shows up as things like irritability, not being able to sleep, and just this constant, draining state of high alert. So, why does the body get stuck in this terrible loop? This slide gives us a peek under the hood, biologically speaking. On one hand, you've got the body's alarm system. After a trauma, stress hormones like adrenaline can just stay cranked up, keeping you in a constant fight or flight mode. Then, on the other hand, you have the brain's memory center. For people with PTSD, the hippocampus, which is like the brain's librarian for memories and emotions, can be affected. This might be why those traumatic memories get stuck and feel like they're happening right now instead of being filed away safely in the past. So we've just seen how PTSD can grow out of a single overwhelming event. But what if the trauma isn't a single event at all? I mean, what happens when that distressing experience isn't a car crash or a one-time assault, but something that just goes on and on and on, often in a situation where there's just no way out? This is where that distinction we talked about becomes absolutely critical. And that brings us to complex PTSD, or CPTSD. As the NHS defines it, CPTSD comes from recurring or long-term trauma. The crucial difference here is the nature of that trauma. It's prolonged and very often it's interpersonal. That means it's inflicted by another person, and frequently it's someone who is supposed to be a source of safety and trust. And if you look at the causes here, it just makes the difference so clear. We're not talking about a single event. We're talking about prolonged situations, like ongoing childhood abuse, domestic violence, or being held captive. In these cases, the trauma isn't just an event that happens. It becomes the entire environment. Escape feels impossible. And that betrayal of trust is what can be so devastating to a person's core sense of who they are. Now, this is a really, really important point. Someone with CPTSD experiences all those core symptoms of PTSD that we just talked about, the re-experiencing, the avoidance, the hyperarousal. But then on top of all of that, there's this entire additional layer of difficulty that fundamentally affects their identity and their ability to connect with other people. And this right here is that complex layer. When trauma is prolonged and interpersonal, it can deeply damage a person's identity. And that leads to these persistent feelings of worthlessness or deep shame, intense difficulty managing emotions, a profound sense of being disconnected from everyone else, and of course, recurring problems trying to form and maintain healthy relationships.
All right, so we have the pieces. Now let's put them side by side and really see the difference clearly.
Okay, this table really breaks it all down for us. Look at the cause. For PTSD, it's usually a single event. For CPTSD, it's prolonged, repeated trauma. Now look at the core symptoms. They both share them: re-experiencing, avoidance, hyperarousal. But that final row, that is the absolute key differentiator. CPTSD has those additional symptoms, those deep-seated difficulties with emotional control, feelings of worthlessness, and severe relationship problems. This is the heart of the distinction.
Now, understanding this difference isn't just an academic exercise. It's absolutely vital for treatment. So, let's shift our focus to the paths toward healing, because, and this is so important, recovery is absolutely possible. I really want to just take a moment with this quote from the NHS, because it's incredibly powerful. It's possible for PTSD to be successfully treated many years after the traumatic event. It's never too late to get help. That is such a profound message of hope. It means the timeline doesn't close on recovery. Ever. So what does that healing journey actually look like? Well, it's a structured process. It starts with a detailed assessment to make sure the treatment plan is tailored perfectly to the individual. Then, the primary treatment is talking therapies designed specifically for trauma. Medication might also be part of the picture, but it's usually there to support the therapy, not as a standalone fix. And the two main therapies recommended by the NHS are right here. On one side, you have trauma-focused CBT. This therapy helps you identify and change the unhelpful thought patterns and behaviors that got wired in by the trauma. On the other side is EMDR. That stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Now, it uses techniques like guided eye movements to help your brain reprocess traumatic memories so they finally lose their intense emotional charge.
And this brings us right back to why that distinction is so important. For complex PTSD, treatment often starts with those same therapies, CBT or EMDR, to address the core trauma. But because CPTSD affects so many other areas of a person's life, the treatment also has to include ongoing phased support for all those additional layers, things like depression, addiction, and especially those deep-seated difficulties with relationships. It's a more comprehensive approach for a much more complex injury.
So let's wrap up with something to think about, knowing that trauma can show up in these very distinct ways, as an echo of a single moment, or as a deep fracture from prolonged experiences. How does that change the way we talk about trauma? I think it pushes us to move beyond a one-size-fits-all view and toward a more nuanced, more empathetic, and ultimately, a much more helpful understanding of its enduring impact. Thanks for joining this explainer.